Welcome to the new video of Neurophilos. Get ready to dive into a gripping tale that will leave you breathless, thinking, and inspired. Whether you're here for the mystery, the drama, or the unexpected twists, you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. Let's begin.
The life that looks perfect but feels wrong. Imagine waking up every morning inside a life that seems flawlessly assembled from the outside. The kind of life people admire, a respectable job title printed on a polished business card, a marriage that looks stable enough in holiday photos, children who perform well in school, bills paid on time, a future planned with admirable maturity. To observers, you look like someone who made it. Someone who checked every box society hands you as a blueprint for adulthood. But inside, something tells a different story. It doesn't happen overnight. It starts quietly, so quietly that most people ignore it. A subtle restlessness, a vague sense of offness, like a faint vibration under the floorboards. At first you dismiss it as stress, tiredness, or maybe the natural boredom of routine. But the feeling grows. It spreads. It becomes heavier, sharper, more insistent. Not sadness. Not clinical depression. Something more elusive. Something spiritual. A feeling as if the soul is suffocating. As if it has been sealed beneath layers of responsibilities, expectations, and roles you never consciously chose. You play them well, too well. The obedient child. The reliable adult. The competent professional. The agreeable partner. The one who always does what is expected. But beneath the performance, a crack begins to form. Carl Gustav Jung called this moment the beginning of the midlife crisis, though the crisis itself can arrive long before midlife. According to him, it is not a failure or a breakdown. It is an urgent message. A warning. A cry from the deepest part of the psyche, the authentic self, trying to rise before it is buried for good. Jung noticed a pattern in people who came to him for help. Many were between the ages of 25 and 40. They had accomplished everything society promised would lead to fulfillment. They had the degrees, the job, the house, the partner. They had followed every instruction with admirable discipline. And yet, upon arriving at the destination they were told would bring meaning, they found themselves staring into a void. A hollow feeling. A sense of profound emptiness. A fear they couldn't explain even to themselves. Because deep inside, they realized a devastating truth. They had spent decades living as someone they were never meant to be. They had lived as a character shaped to please parents, teachers, employers, friends, partners, everyone except themselves. A self designed to be acceptable, not to be real. A life structured to win approval, not to express truth. This disconnect, Jung said, comes from a life lived entirely from the persona, the social mask every person creates to function in the world. At first, the persona is a tool, a flexible layer that helps you navigate society. But over time, it can harden. It becomes a shell. A prison. A version of yourself so polished and consistent that you begin to believe it is who you are. But it isn't. Your true self, with its raw desires, instinctive talents, inner calling, and natural complexity, gets pushed deeper into the unconscious. Silenced. Hidden. Forgotten. And the cost of that silencing is enormous. Chronic anxiety that never fully goes away. Fatigue that sleep cannot resolve. A vague resentment toward people you love. A sense that something essential is missing from your life. A feeling that you are living on autopilot, performing instead of existing. All because you were never taught to ask the simplest, most dangerous question. What if this life isn't mine? That question is the spark, the first flicker of awakening. But it is also terrifying. Because if the life you built is not truly yours, then who built it? And who are you underneath it? Most people push the question away. They bury it beneath distractions, work, perfectionism, or more roles. But the question returns. It always returns. Louder each time. More painful. More urgent. And when the persona becomes too heavy to carry, when the mask tightens to the point of choking, something inside begins to break. The facade trembles. The soul pushes against the walls. This is not collapse. This is not the end. This is the beginning. The beginning of the journey back to yourself, the part of you that existed before the roles, before the expectations, before you learned to trade authenticity for acceptance. The journey starts with a whisper. A whisper that says, "This life looks perfect. But it is not mine." And once that whisper is heard, nothing can ever be the same. Roles, masks, and the birth of the false self. From the moment you are born, the world begins shaping you. Before you speak your first word, expectations are already waiting. Before you understand who you are told who you should be. And this shaping continues quietly, subtly, relentlessly, until one day you wake up inside a personality crafted more by others than by yourself. This is how the false self begins. Most people imagine masks as things you consciously put on. But in reality, the persona, the social mask Jung described, is formed long before you realize you are wearing it. It begins in childhood, in the small corrections and subtle punishments that teach you what parts of yourself are acceptable and what parts must be hidden. A boy who cries is told to be strong. A girl who shows anger is told to be pleasant. A child who asks too many questions is labeled difficult. A teenager who dreams big is told to be realistic. Slowly, you learn that authenticity comes with consequences. You learn that some emotions bring discomfort to others. You learn that honesty can lead to rejection. So, you start trimming pieces of yourself. You learn to behave, to adapt, to fit in. And with each adaptation, the true self shrinks a little more. At first, these roles feel like survival strategies. They help you receive approval, affection, and safety. They teach you how to avoid conflict, how to please authority, how to be seen as good. Society rewards you for obeying the script. Parents praise the obedient child. Teachers praise the quiet student. Companies reward the agreeable employee. Partners appreciate the predictable spouse. But beneath that praise, something begins to change. The role you learn to play becomes a habit. The habit becomes a pattern. The pattern becomes a personality. And eventually, the personality becomes a prison. You forget who you were before the world taught you who to be. The mother who sacrificed her dreams to take care of everyone else forgets what she once wanted for herself. The man who learned to suppress every emotion eventually believes he does not have the right to feel. The professional who built a life around achievement begins to think their worth depends entirely on performance. These roles become the pillars on which your life stands. They offer structure, validation, predictability. They make the world manageable. But at the same time, they demand a high psychological price. Because every time you betray yourself for acceptance, a small part of your soul goes silent. You begin to confuse function with identity. You start believing you are the role you play. You forget that the mask is not your face. The worst part? Society applauds these masks. A woman who never says no is called selfless. A man who hides his pain is admired as strong. A person who abandons their passion for a stable career is praised as responsible. But behind that applause is a slow spiritual dehydration. A life performed rather than lived. A quiet ache that grows stronger each year. A sense of being disconnected from your own inner world. And this internal disconnection is not a dramatic explosion. It is subtle. It shows up in small ways. You smile without feeling joy. You accomplish things without feeling proud. You rest without feeling rested. You talk without revealing yourself. You live without truly living. There is a moment, often between the ages of 25 and 40, when the weight of the mask becomes unbearable. The persona, once useful, becomes suffocating. You start to feel like a ghost inside your own body, watching your life from a distance. Everything looks fine from the outside, yet nothing feels meaningful on the inside. That moment is the beginning of the crisis. Not a crisis of life falling apart, but a crisis of identity. A crisis born from the gap between who you are and who you pretend to be. Your soul begins to push back. It whispers, protests, rebels. It creates discomfort, boredom, irritation, sadness, restlessness. Not to punish you, but to wake you up. Because a life built on roles cannot sustain the self forever. Eventually, the real you begins to demand space. It might show up as a longing you cannot name. A dream you thought you buried. A desire you are afraid to acknowledge. A silence that feels too heavy to ignore. This chapter is the recognition of that tension, the moment you understand that the mask you wear has become the barrier between you and the life you are meant to live. Before the authentic self can rise, the false self must be seen for what it is, a performance you mastered too well. And once you see the mask, you cannot unsee it. This is where the real journey begins. Not with denial, not with comfort, but with the courage to finally look inward. When the soul revolts, the meaning of inner collapse. There comes a moment in adulthood when something inside you begins to crack, not because anything catastrophic has happened, but because nothing on the outside matches what is happening within. It is subtle at first. An unexplained fatigue. A sadness that arrives without a clear trigger. A lingering irritability you can't explain. A sense of waking up each morning already tired, as if life has become a weight you drag rather than a path you walk. Most people blame stress. Or their job. Or their partner. Or the economy. Or just getting older. But Jung had a far more unsettling explanation. He believed that what many call burnout, depression, or existential fatigue is often the soul attempting to revolt against a life that has drifted too far from authenticity. To Jung, this inner collapse was not a psychological malfunction. It was a message. A symbolic plea. You have abandoned who you are. The crisis begins quietly. You start feeling out of place in your own life. You look around and sense you're living a story that no longer fits, yet you don't know how to rewrite it. You experience a strange kind of grief, not for something you lost, but for someone you never became. This is the soul awakening. You may notice yourself becoming impatient, snapping over small things, or feeling an inexplicable urge to run away from everything familiar. You may fantasize about starting over in another city, another job, another life. These impulses are not escapism, they are the self trying to break free from the prison of the persona. The symptoms of this revolt can be frightening. You sleep but wake up exhausted. You smile but feel nothing inside. You achieve but do not feel fulfilled. You are surrounded by people but feel profoundly alone. You begin questioning everything: your job, your relationships, your decisions, your values. And while the outside world sees stability, the inner world trembles. That tension, the war between the life you show and the life you feel, is what Jung called the existential crisis. He insisted this crisis is not the beginning of destruction, but the beginning of rebirth. The collapse happens because the soul refuses to participate in the performance anymore. It refuses to keep living scripted routines. It refuses to keep pretending that survival is the same as living. This revolt is the psyche's last defense against complete self-abandonment. The more you ignore it, the louder it becomes. What starts as discomfort becomes emotional numbness. What begins as tiredness becomes despair. What begins as quiet unrest becomes a storm that sweeps through your entire inner life. But here is the essential truth Jung taught. Suffering is not punishment. Suffering is communication. It is the self saying, "You have gone too far in the wrong direction. Return." Yet most people try to silence this call. They take medication without addressing the root. They distract themselves with entertainment, work, or consumption. They change superficial elements of life hoping to escape the discomfort, moving to a new city, switching jobs, entering new relationships, only to discover that the emptiness follows them. Because the problem is never outside. The problem is the distance from yourself. The further you drift from your inner truth, the more violent the psyche's rebellion becomes. Emotional breakdowns, sudden anger, unexplained sadness, impulsive decisions, these are not flaws. They are alarms. The soul is warning you. Stop. Look. Listen. The revolt is a sign that something buried still lives. If you were emotionally dead inside, you wouldn't feel anything at all. But you do feel. Even the pain is proof that something in you refuses to vanish. This is the paradox of the inner collapse. It hurts because you are waking up. Jung believed the crisis is a sacred threshold. A painful but necessary initiation. It forces you to confront everything you avoided, your shadow, your fears, your lost dreams, your suppressed truth. But to cross this threshold, you must stop numbing yourself. You must listen to what the pain is trying to say. You must acknowledge that the life you built around the persona is no longer sustainable. This collapse is not the end of your story. It is the end of pretending. It is the moment life refuses to let you sleepwalk any longer. It is the moment your inner world demands to be rebuilt, not from expectations, but from truth. And this is where the next chapter begins. The descent into the self. The moment you stop escaping and finally turn inward. Conscious descent, the courage to stop pretending. At some point in the journey of self-awakening, a decisive moment arrives, a point where running no longer works. Distractions lose their power. The job, the achievements, the routines, even the relationships that once helped you avoid discomfort, none of them can hold the collapsing structure together anymore. This is the moment Jung called the conscious descent, the turning inward, the deliberate decision to face the truth instead of performing it. The descent begins with a simple but terrifying act. You stop pretending. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But quietly, internally, honestly. You stop pretending the job fulfills you. You stop pretending the relationship nourishes you. You stop pretending the routines are enough. You stop pretending you are fine when you feel empty. You stop pretending the life you built is the life you want. This honesty is the first step, and it feels like stepping off a cliff. Because for the first time, you are not adjusting yourself to meet expectations. You are not trying to be agreeable, useful, or admired. You are looking inward with ruthless clarity, and seeing the gap between the life you live and the life you need. Jung warned that this stage is not gentle. It is not peaceful. It is not warm spiritual enlightenment. It is raw, disorienting, messy. You begin asking questions you've avoided for years. Is this dream really mine? Or did someone hand it to me? What desires did I bury to fit in? What version of myself did I sacrifice for acceptance? If no one were watching, how would I live? These questions act like psychological dynamite. They explode the foundations of the persona you spent a lifetime constructing. The descent confronts you with the shadow, the parts of yourself you hid because they felt dangerous, embarrassing, or impractical. These include forgotten dreams, buried desires, suppressed emotions, and versions of yourself you were told to abandon. Facing the shadow is frightening because it requires you to admit something profound. You are more than the role you play. You are more than the mask you perfected. And that truth threatens everything built on the persona. This is why many people reject the descent. They cling to the familiar lies. They call it maturity, duty, being responsible. They keep the mask glued on, even as it suffocates them. But the descent demands courage, the courage to disappoint people. To be misunderstood. To lose approval. To let parts of your life fall apart. Because what collapses is not the real you, but the false structure you created to survive. And survival is not the same as living. As you go deeper, the psyche forces you to confront the compromises you made. The creativity you gave up to be practical. The feelings you swallowed to keep the peace. The ambitions you abandoned to fit a role. The passions you dismissed because they didn't guarantee success. The parts of you that were alive before you learned to hide them. This confrontation is painful. But it is also liberating. The conscious descent is not self-destruction. It is self-excavation. You peel back the layers of conditioning, obligation, and fear, revealing a self that has been waiting for decades. A self that is raw but honest. Fragile but real. Confused but alive. But to reach this self, you must endure a period of internal chaos. The ego resists, it wants to maintain control. The persona panics, it fears being dismantled. The shadow threatens to overwhelm, it wants recognition. This inner conflict can feel like falling apart. But Jung taught that falling apart is often the beginning of falling into yourself. The descent forces you to make difficult choices. To say no when you always said yes. To admit you are unhappy when you always smiled. To walk away from what drains you. To tell the truth even when it disrupts the peace. To reclaim what you abandoned. To choose yourself, even when others call it selfish. You begin to understand that authenticity has a price, and the price is letting go of the version of you that made everyone else comfortable. But the deeper the descent, the clearer the truth becomes. You cannot rise until you stop pretending. You cannot awaken until you stop performing. You cannot live as yourself until you confront who you became for others. The descent is frightening, but it is also sacred. It is the turning point where suffering stops being an enemy and becomes a guide. It is where pain becomes a compass. It is where you stop running from yourself and begin walking toward your truth. And once you take this path inward, something remarkable happens. You finally start clearing the ground for a new life. But the most difficult threshold is still ahead. The moment when you understand that time is running out. That avoiding authenticity has consequences. and that the self will not wait forever. The point of no return, rebuilding a life that belongs to you. There comes a moment in every inner journey when hesitation becomes dangerous. A moment when postponing change stops being harmless and quietly turns into a slow form of psychological self-destruction. Jung called this threshold the point of no return, the moment the self begins to die if authenticity is delayed any longer. Many people arrive at this crossroads without realizing it. It does not announce itself with alarms or dramatic events. It arrives disguised as routine, as resignation, as the quiet acceptance that this is just how life is. It appears in the normalization of mediocrity, boredom, and emotional numbness. It appears when you stop expecting anything from life because you've convinced yourself you don't deserve more. This is the silent death of the self. It happens the moment you start shrinking your desires to fit your circumstances. When you begin treating your dreams as childish. When you tell yourself this is the best you can hope for. When you let the persona tighten around you until it becomes your entire world. But the self never dies all at once. It fights back. It sends warnings in the form of impulses you don't understand. The sudden desire to run away. The fantasy of starting over. Irrational bursts of anger. Deep irritation with routine. Or a longing you cannot name. These impulses are not weaknesses. They are the soul's last attempts to save itself. The tragedy is that most people silence these warnings with excuses. I'll leave this job once I'm more stable. I'll end this relationship when the timing is better. I'll start creating when life calms down. I'll return to myself when I have time. These are not plans. These are delays. And delays turn into years. Years turn into decades. And decades turn into a life you barely lived. Jung believed that ignoring the call to authenticity is one of the greatest dangers of adulthood. Not because the self explodes, but because it withers. You stop noticing the emptiness. You stop questioning the routines. You stop listening to your inner voice. You begin drifting, surviving, functioning, but not living. And the terrifying part is this. You can get used to being disconnected from yourself. You can get used to the numbness. You can get used to the boredom. You can get used to the quiet despair. You can even convince yourself it's normal. But deep inside, something still remembers who you were meant to be. Something remembers the passion you buried, the dreams you postponed, the truth you hid. And the more you forget, the more violently the unconscious pushes back. This is why emotional crises appear. Why sudden collapses happen. Why relationships shatter. Why careers fall apart. Why breakdowns erupt without warning. The psyche destroys what you refuse to change. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Because the self has limits. And when it can no longer tolerate the persona's dominance, it begins dismantling everything that no longer aligns with truth. But here lies the hope, the gift hidden inside the collapse. If your life is falling apart, it means something in you is still alive. Something still wants to awaken. Something still refuses to die silently. Something still believes you can return to yourself. The question now is, what do you do with this awakening? Jung believed that rebirth begins not with grand gestures, but with 3 simple movements, small acts powerful enough to shift the entire direction of your life. 1. Recover something that was yours. Before you adapted to expectations, there were things you loved purely for the joy they brought. Writing. Drawing. Reading. Music. Nature. Imagination. movement, solitude, curiosity. These weren't hobbies, they were fragments of the true self. Reconnecting with them is not about productivity, it is about resurrection. It is how you remember who you were before you learned to perform. 2. Start telling small truths. Truth is a muscle. If you never use it, it weakens. Begin by telling honest sentences that feel small but are enormous in meaning. No. I don't want that. I'm tired. This doesn't feel right. This is not who I am anymore. Every truth spoken breaks a piece of the persona. 3. Practice conscious disappointment. You will disappoint people. People who depended on your compliance. People who benefited from your silence. People who only loved the version of you that made them comfortable. Let them be disappointed. Their comfort is not worth your disappearance. Choosing yourself is not selfish. Choosing yourself is survival. The reconstruction of an authentic life is not fast, easy, or linear. It is a slow rebuilding, not from expectations, but from truth. A life built not to impress, but to reflect your soul. And at the end of this process, when the masks are gone and the roles dissolve, one question remains. Will you choose the life you were trained to live? Or the life that finally feels like your own? This is the beginning of true authenticity. The beginning of real freedom. And if Chapter 5 is the point of no return, then what comes next is even more important. How do you live as the self, fully, boldly, without apology?